From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Well, welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. We talk about a new Montana being born in this crucible, and one of the areas where a significant change in progressive change from Montana occurred was in higher education that occurred coming out of the new Constitution. There were a lot of changes in that Constitution that were important, and one of the foremost changes was the changes in higher education in Montana. And we have a very special guest today to talk about that, and that's Larry Pettit, sometimes known as Dr. Lawrence K. Pettit, but it's Larry to his friends. Larry was the first commissioner of higher education in the state of Montana, a position that emerged out of the new Constitution. I want to mention he's got an amazing career. I'll talk to you about it a little bit in the sense that you had a career working with, when you went and worked for Senator Murray in the U.S. Senate and Senator Metcalf in the U.S. Senate. When you came out, you got your bachelor's degree at UM. You got a master's in history from St. Louis,
Washington University.
Washington University in St. Louis, and a PhD was where?
University of Wisconsin.
Wisconsin, and then you ended up doing all this work, but you ended up at Montana State University as a history professor.
Political science
professor. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you kind of became more visible in the political scene in Montana when you became Tom Judge's campaign manager in the general election of 1972.
Right.
And our recollection, of course, was that that's right when the Constitution also passed. Almost the very time you were taking over the governor's campaign, the Constitution of Montana passed, and that was the seeds of your new life, really, that was occurring there.
Yeah.
I want to mention, too, before we get too far into it, that Larry has written a wonderful book called If You Live by the Sword. And if you live by the sword, politics in the making and unmaking of a university president, because you were president in different forms of about 3 different universities, Southern Illinois, Pennsylvania University, was it?
Well, when I left here, I was chancellor of a university system in South Texas.
Okay.
And then president of Southern Illinois University. And then for my last 11 years, president of Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which is in the town of Indiana. It has nothing to do with Indiana University of Bloomington. But that's a university of about 15,000 students.
All that goes to establish your bona fides in education, which is where you.
Yeah.
Now, by the way, I'm going to hold this back up again just so we can get a good shot of it. But it's an excellent book about the blending of politics and education, and that is the context that we were going to talk about, the changes in higher education that came out of the new Constitution, because prior to the passage of the 1972 Constitution, higher education in Montana was controlled and often victimized by the political processes of Montana. Alternatingly, that governors and legislatures would impose constraints on the education system. There were prominent faculty sometimes, if they had an outspoken position, who suddenly had to get fired because they were counter to the political strength of what was going on in Montana at the time. There was management control, there was teaching and content control, and these were things that came to the fore when the Constitutional Convention met. And as a result of that, they proposed in the Constitution a whole new structure. And I wonder if you might expound a little bit on what the previous structure was, and then we'll go into what the new structure was.
Well, previously there was one board appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate.
Board of Public Education.
It was called the Board of Public Education, yeah. But it went into it called itself the Board of Regents when it considered the university system matters. But it was the same people. And
they did K through 12.
They did K through 12
as well.
And K through 12 seemed to be their major focus. And the superintendent of public instruction, an elected constitutional officer, was ex officio on the board for both K-12 and higher education. And there's no doubt that and also that board had no CEO for higher education. It had an executive secretary who was pretty much
ministerial,
yeah. Director of the staff, and staff support to the board himself. And there's no doubt but what the Constitutional Convention wanted to remove higher education from the political branches. And in Article 10, Section 9, they provided that the Board of Regents, which would be separate now from the Board of Education, that the Board of Regents would have exclusive management and control over the university system. That was a dramatic change that not everybody saw coming because it was open to interpretation. And it caused a lot of confusion too. One of the confusing things is that they called the Chief Executive Officer a Commissioner of Higher Education when the more appropriate title would have been Chancellor, which would indicate line authority over the university presidents, which is what we ended up doing. But the commissioner title was confusing because normally that indicates an executive officer for a coordinating board rather than a governing board, and particularly one with constitutional autonomy. Mm-hmm. So,
but were they were essentially reacting in the con to the fact that it looked like if you thought about all the university units as being ships in the Navy, you had a bunch of ships in the Navy and you had no admiral.
That's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, the change was not popular on some of the campuses, but nor was the constitutional autonomy very popular among legislators or governors. And the first commissioner was predicted in Helena to last about 2 years, and I lasted 6. But
well, you're from Lewistown. You're tough, is that right?
Yeah. I suppose I can't say I'm from Butte, but I'm tough anyway. Yeah. And there were arrows and slings coming from all directions, and I was eager to take this on, but I knew what I was doing too, and where I had to go with it, and. I had some good regents. The governor's job. I've spent my first 6 months.
Let's back up just a second and touch on the fact that you came to Helena from Bozeman to manage the campaign for the governor.
Right.
And he had a successful election. Mm-hmm. That was Governor Judge, and he was running against Big Ed Smith mm-hmm. on the Republican ticket.
Right.
He'd survived the primary, where he had competition inside the Democratic primary mm-hmm. From Dick DeZevi,
right.
who was a Senate Majority Leader from Great Falls, but mm-hmm. he had defeated DeZevi. And we always want to remember that they were running on the tail end of Forrest Anderson's single but dramatically history-changing term mm-hmm. as a governor. That Tom asked you to come and run, Tom Judge, and run the general election campaign. So when November hit and you won, You then did what most people do at that stage. You slid over, so to speak, into the governor's staff. Could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing there? Because there was an evolution that went from being the campaign manager to being on the staff to ending up as the Commissioner of Higher Education.
Yeah, first of all, we decided what I would do. And the governor was stunned when I told him I'd rather be Commissioner of Higher Education than be head of any state department, because he didn't quite understand the change yet. And he saw the commissioner as a continuation of the executive secretary, you know, and he said, "You want to sit down there and just direct a staff of 5 rather than being a head of a..."
Push a little paper.
Yeah, and I said, "I don't see it that way. I see the commissioner as the chief executive officer of the university system, and everything's changing under the Constitution." And that was going to take effect when the Constitution took effect in July of '73. So from January to July, the agreement was I would be in the governor's office. I was not the chief of staff. Ron Richards had that position. But I was reporting directly to the governor, and I was working on 2 things. One, helping to get through the legislature, because you know, as you know, you're elected in November, and all of a sudden in January you got to put together an administration.
You're
and
thrust
a budget
into it, yeah.
And then second, to be in charge of the process of finding people to appoint to boards and commissions, including, as it turns out, the Board of Regents, of course.
The new Board of Regents.
The new board, yeah. Now, the old board had carryovers, and some of them had to be assigned to the Board of Regents and some to the Board of Education. And then the governor was to fill in, appointing the new ones.
So pursuant to the constitutional change and anticipating it by the 1st of July of '73, there was a Board of Public Education which was for K through 12, and there was a Board of Regents, which was for higher ed. And you had to divide up the old board and pick new people? The governor did?
Yes. And there was provision in the Constitution to combine the 2 boards on occasion, where they would meet as I think the State Board of Education.
Just the Board of Education. In fact, that happens periodically even now.
Yeah. And it didn't work exactly as it was supposed to. It was supposed to indicate that there's a seamless system from K through graduate school, and in some respects there is, but it's 2 different sets of expertise. And inevitably we'd get a meeting going, and it'd last maybe 20 minutes, half hour, and one of the regents would move that we adjourn. It wasn't a very it just wasn't, it didn't work very well, because we each had so much to do with our own business. And so in any event, I had a big part in the governor's appointment of the new regents. And then came July. They needed, once all the regents were appointed, took a while, they needed someone immediately to be the executive officer of the new system. And I was available, and I was the one a lot of people had knowledge and experience in Montana politics, and others had the academic background, but I was about the only one around who had both. I mean, I had, in addition to the PhD and teaching at Penn State, I'd also been a senior staff member on the American Council on Education, where I was doing federal relations and dealing with university research and tax law affecting charitable contributions and a variety of other things. So I had that background. The problem is people in Montana knew me politically, associating with me with Metcalf and Murray, and then Judge, of course, more recently as campaign manager. And a lot of them thought when I was appointed that I was kind of a political hack. And so we had a little, you know, and it was hard for me. I wanted very much, I had 3 chief aims, in addition to the ordinary one of getting money out of the legislature for the campuses. The other concerns I had, because I was the first commissioner, were the precedents. First of all, in how we established the position. And I wanted to establish it as a professional higher education position where we would recruit subsequent commissioners from the same national pool as we recruited the Bozeman and Missoula presidents. And I didn't want it to be seen as a bureaucratic post or as a political post. Very hard for me, given that my image was political among most of the people in the state. Second, I wanted to preserve the constitutional autonomy because I was conscious of the fact that it would be possible if the legislature and the governor made incursions into the constitutional autonomy of the regions and the regions let them do it instead of protesting, that down the line a subsequent commissioner and board of regents might want to challenge it, and some court might say, well, you've already voluntarily given up your constitutional autonomy. So I was very set on protecting that, which made it very difficult for me because it made me an adversary of the governor and the legislature in their eyes, the same people I was trying to get appropriations out of. And then third, I'm having a Rick Perry moment. I can't remember.
Well, I think the CEO type of role.
The
university units.
To implement the new layer of executive authority over the campuses. Now, this was just enormously controversial in Missoula, of course, and my alma mater, but that didn't matter to them. And the newspapers in Missoula, Bozeman, and Butte were terribly hostile to the idea, and they made it very personal.
Well, it would be kind of interesting that in some cases, you know, they were probably relishing the fact that the university system was getting a little detached from the political arena, but then, of course, any kind of change you want to make to our little turf, watch out.
Yes.
You know, when you speak to this and you speak about the regents and the role of the commissioner and protecting it and making sure the regents didn't give away the authority they had, I wonder if you might just reflect a little bit about that first set of regents and who got put on there and why they got put on there by you, the role that you advised the governor and the governor made the appointments, but what type of folks were being chosen to do this?
Well, the first two were Ted James, former lieutenant governor from Great Falls, who ran against his own governor, Tim Babcock, in a primary subsequently, and had always been a pretty moderate Republican. His father-in-law, his first father-in-law, was Sam Ford, a Republican governor.
Former Republican governor.
And the vice chair was Mary Pace, a school teacher, an English teacher in Bozeman, who was, she and her husband were very close to me and the governor. And she had close ties to MSU, Bozeman, and Ted James had close ties to U of M, Missoula. And that kind of balanced that out as in the leadership. And then the other members, Lola Hanson from Sydney, Louis Evans, an architect from Billings. There were, and then Ted Heberly from Havre was on the old board.
He was a holdover.
He was a holdover and carried over. And I, the first student regent under this alignment was Sid Thomas, who had been my student at MSU.
And then federal district court appellate judge.
Exactly. And he was a student at the University of Montana Law School when he was a student regent. So he had this dual loyalty to
pretty high quality initial board.
It was a good board.
I want to focus a little bit on Ted James, and in doing that, recall that he'd been elected lieutenant governor when the governor and lieutenant governor were elected separately. So in 1964, Tim Babcock, who had ascended to the governorship as when Governor Nutter was killed in the plane wreck, ran for re-election against Roland Rennie. Interestingly, it's hard to comprehend that a university president, Montana State College president, was the candidate for governor. But nonetheless, Babcock won, and at the same time, in a separate election, Ted James won and became lieutenant governor. So for those 4 years, they were governing together, except they were separate. And there was a lot of differences between them, and it ended up with Ted James running against his own, I wouldn't say his own, but as lieutenant governor running against Governor Babcock in 1968. And my recollection was he got beat in a reasonably close race, but it wasn't that close. And so suddenly he was not lieutenant governor anymore. Babcock continued, ran and got beat in the general election, and Forrest Anderson was governor. So here we are 4 years later. Ted James had been out of elected office for 4 years, and the Democratic governor, under advice from you, asked him to be the Board of Regents, and he became chairman. Tell us about him particularly and that role as chairman.
Well, he was a very strong chairman. He really did run the board, at least that initial board, and he was very committed to the university system and very committed to the constitutional autonomy that the system had. Very academic in his interests, a lawyer, but an intellectual lawyer with great political instincts also. And there's no way that he would shy away from protecting the university system against political micromanagement from the legislature or the governor. So when the time came to rise to the occasion, he was set to go, and he led the regents on my recommendation into filing suit against, as it turned out, against the governor to enjoin him from enforcing things that the legislature had put in the appropriations bill, but the legislature was already adjourned, so the suit was named the governor as the defendant, and he never got over that and never forgave us.
So Ted James as chairman, working with you as the first commissioner, as you were trying to work through how to get this stuff done, this started July of '73.
Right.
And of course the appropriations that were passed in the session of '73, held for 2 years.
Right.
So the first time the new structure, the new independent, quasi-independent structure of the university system went to the legislature with the budget was the '75 session.
Yes, yeah.
And so when they passed that, there was some real disagreement about what constraints they wanted to impose upon the university system, in spite of the fact the Constitution said it was.
Well, the legislature that year in '75, right off the bat, included in the appropriations bill for the university system a list of pretty egregious controls, where they were actually dictating salaries and a variety of other things. And when that bill passed and was signed by the governor, I said to the regents, okay, the ball's in our court. We've got to challenge this, because if we don't, the ball game may be over. And we have a responsibility as the first board and the first commissioner under the new Constitution to set precedent. So we filed suit. A good friend of mine and the governor's, Milton Datsopoulos, was our attorney, plus a staff attorney, Barry Yort. They did a wonderful job. The case was called Regents Against Judge. And he said to me, why me? Why are you naming me? And I tried to explain to him it was, under the circumstances, it had to be.
You had to sue the governor because the legislature was going.
Was adjourned,
since he's the executive.
And he did sign the bill.
Yeah.
And he would have implemented it had we not called this to his attention, I think. And he did. He was quoted in June saying that he hoped we lost the suit. So he was not very kindly disposed toward it. The suit was finally, the Supreme Court finally ruled in December 19th, 1975, and we won the case in that our constitutional authority was upheld. But what happened afterwards is the Joint appropriations subcommittee for higher education in the legislature started subterfuges to get around that. And one of the things they did was attach, they knew enough not to write the controls into the legislative language, into the appropriations language. So they would attach what they called letters of intent and say, here's how we want you to use this and here's how we don't. And so our response was this. We knew they had the power of the purse, and if we needed to get along with them. And every time we mentioned the word constitutional independence, they interpreted that as arrogance. So we had to figure out a modus operandi here. And what it was trying to find a way to agree with them to begin with. And when we did, we'd send them a letter that I would draft from Ted James for his signature, saying, included a disclaimer in the last paragraph, which would say the Board of Regents of the Montana University System, by taking this action voluntarily, does not mean to cede any of its constitutional autonomy under Article 10, Section 9 of the Montana Constitution.
Boilerplate language, but very telling.
Yeah, and then we would meet with them in those cases where we disagreed, and they were a minority. We were able to agree with them on most things. But when we disagreed, we'd meet with them and try to work something out where we could meet their goals, not necessarily their requirements. And usually that could be done. But they were smarting under that, and some of the legislators never got over it. And
the decision rendered in December was a wholesale win for the university system. How did it look?
I interpreted it as a win. The language was kind of soft. I mean, but it was, there was no other way to interpret it except as a win for us. Yeah.
So suddenly you had suddenly a little more adversarial relationship.
Yeah, I would guess so.
With both the legislature, although that's inherent anyway,
yeah,
and the governor, who one might say would have been an ally, but suddenly now you were independent.
It was luckily for the university system, their anger was personalized more toward me and Ted James.
So you guys became lightning rods. So right. The whole system didn't suffer, huh?
So we still got appropriations. You know, we did pretty well during that period in terms of appropriations increases. It was it was the 70s. It was a great time.
Well, the economy was good back then.
Economy was good,
there was money there.
And the political culture, the political environment was quite a bit more liberal than today. Or any time since, because the 80s and 90s were disastrous. But it was, it was not the fact that we guarded our independence and won did not do us any harm in terms of the appropriations process. There was a move in the Senate early on in '75 to amend the Constitution to return control to the legislature. That was before the appropriations bill was enacted that year. We killed that in the House, and then of course the Attorney General Woodall, who was a little quirky anyway, notified us early on he wasn't going to provide us any legal assistance or support because we were independent, which meant we had to build a legal staff and then open ourselves to criticism for increasing the staff and all that sort of thing, which happens. But in any event, it worked out pretty well.
Now, given the fact that the Constitutional Convention's decision to advance a strongly independent university system because of the political machinations of the past that were not favorable, was a significant advancement. Were all states like this, or was this did Montana, was this an empowerment of the education system in Montana that went beyond what a lot of other states were doing?
Oh yes, yeah, that made Montana a leader. There are other situations where, for example, in Texas, where the oil royalty money goes to the University of Texas, 2/3 the University of Texas system and 1/3 to Texas A&M system. And the legislature can't do anything about that. There may be some other states where the entire system has constitutional independence, or there may be some where the flagship university does anyway, and perhaps the land-grant institution as well. But I think it put Montana out front, and it's been a good thing. I don't know that it would ever be duplicated anywhere else today because the national culture has changed so much politically, and but that's another whole discussion.
When you look at the fact that this change took place, this is part of the crucible of change. This change took place, and the kind of inevitable movement of the previous power structure to create retrenchment back from that. I mean, that seems like that was occurring right off the bat.
Yes. I think they wanted to test it right away, or else their staff and the members themselves just weren't sensitive to how the Constitution had changed things. That's a possibility, because very few people understood the importance of that wording in the Constitution. I think, and so it might have been come as a surprise to them that we filed suit, or they might have wanted to provoke the suit to get it clarified.
But you succeeded, you and the Board of Regents, through the lawsuit, was the first step of protecting that autonomy and having it recognized even by the court system, the eventual adjudicator of all this.
Right. And then we hoped fervently that our successors over the years would hold the line and not start giving in.
Now, by the way, before we end the discussion today, we're not going to go there right now. I'm going to ask you to reflect upon current efforts to put more constraints on this system. But in the meantime, you had talked about establishing the role, in the non-political role of the commissioner. That was tough to do, given the way you were perceived.
Yes, yeah, very tough. And as a matter of fact, I was immediately attacked right after I became commissioner. I was immediately attacked by Republican politicians, led by Ed Smith, whom we had defeated.
Well, Jay, that's the price. If you managed the campaign that defeated him, what do you expect? You know.
And the thing is, they were stepping into a trap that they didn't realize, because they didn't know I had a PhD probably. They didn't know I'd taught at Penn State. They didn't know I'd been at the American Council on Education, that I had a pretty good national reputation in higher education. I was known in higher education outside Montana and around
better
the country,
than you were
better than I
Montana.
was in. Yeah. All they knew is I had been the governor's brother-in-law, and I'd been his campaign manager. And so they were starting to say, they were starting to criticize.
They saw that as a
political appointment.
Political appointment.
And so what I did, I had very good relationships with Ted James's brother Scotty, who was editor of the Great Falls Tribune, and with Mike.
Montana is a small state with really long streets, right? Where everyone knows everybody, so.
Yeah. And with Mr. Bowler, who was
Doc Bowler,
who was editor of the Billings Gazette. And I just sent them each a copy of my resume, and they didn't coordinate, but on the same Sunday, they each had lead editorials supporting me and my appointment, and pointing out my credentials in academia, and so that pretty much put that to rest, at least as a public issue. And
I look at that as being kind of the educational equivalent of that day in about 1975 or 77 when Bruce Springsteen was on the front of Time and Newsweek on the same week at the same time.
Kind of thing.
You got him in the Trib and the Gazette at the same time.
Well, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah. Yeah, that was good. And then, of course, at the very end, when I was leaving the position, I'm getting way ahead of us now, but I think it's relevant here, the same two papers gave me a big pat on the back, and the headline on the Billings Gazette's editorial said the unfortunate pioneer,
Yeah.
and really capturing how the first person in that position was going to take a lot of fire and have to make a lot of tough decisions, have to make a lot of enemies, and get a lot of scar tissue. But so I was lucky because of the animosity from the Missoulian and the Montana Standard and whatever the Dillon paper was called.
The Dillon Tribune.
Dillon Tribune.
Yeah.
And then neutrality on the part of the Helen Independent Record, which I welcome, but I had real problems with the Associated Press.
But you
for a while.
lasted 6 years
Yeah,
when the anticipation was a lot less.
right.
So you had steel in your backbone, apparently.
Well, I had to. But there was things. I remember once my youngest child, this is the younger of 2 sons, the youngest of 4 kids, ran all the way from our house on Power Street. He was in elementary school at the time, and all the way down to my office and burst in and said, "Dad, what did you do?" And this was, he thought I was going to go to jail. There was the regular legislative audit of my office came out, and in the written audit report, there was simply mention of the fact that we had leased a car for the commissioners, as we've done for all the presidents,
Right.
and we didn't want any of us to have to drive around in marked cars. I mean, it was we were doing what was done everywhere else nationally, and we leased a Pontiac for me, which we thought was pretty modest, but
Right.
the auditors thought maybe it should have been a little less than that. And
Chevy.
but yeah. But when I met with the auditors, nobody mentioned that. It wasn't even an issue. But the Associated Press reporter who covered it obviously wasn't at the meeting and just read the audit report, and then he made that a huge issue, which it hadn't been in anyone else's mind. And then my son then heard that being read on the radio news.
Thought you were off to the
and
slammer.
yeah,
huh?
and really thought I had done something wrong. But that's the kind of thing that when you're in those positions you encounter. But it was, I thought it was just kind of.
Well, you know, when we talk about in the crucible of change that and all this stuff took place, but that the battle with the established power structure was not easily won.
Right.
And
right.
so if you look at it, there was all this, again, efforts at retrenchment and retention of control by the legislature, in spite of the fact that the people voted in constitutional change.
We had some great supporters. I hesitate to start naming names because I'll forget some, but in the Senate we had Bill Groff on the Democratic side and Bill Mathers on the Republican side, 2 very powerful, highly respected senators with seniority who supported us all the way on everything. They were just wonderful. And we had in the House some good support too. And well, I've got to say the Southwestern Montana delegation, the Butte, Anaconda, and Dillon legislators were always strong supporters of the university system and the commissioner's office and the regents. We could always count on them, and that made things difficult later on when we'll
talk about the Blue Ribbon Commission in a couple of minutes. You know,
Yeah.
When you were trying to implement the CEO authority of the commissioner's office, which was clearly the intent, the flagships particularly, or what kind of resistance did you get? Because I've always found that it's anytime you want to nibble away at anyone's authority, they really guard it carefully.
Oh, yeah.
So-
Well, it has something to do, I think, with perception of institutional prestige, which is why at Missoula they felt so strongly. At Bozeman, which is typical of land-grant universities, they're usually better politicians in working in state politics. You know, they and the faculty at Missoula, or at least the faculty senate, some of the, has a tendency to get pretty indignant pretty easily. And then now the presidents themselves, the only one that challenged me and challenged my authority was Dick Bowers at Missoula, whom we had hired after I became president, so he should have been a little bit loyal to me. But it was the newspapers more than the campuses themselves in those three communities. Now the people at Tech weren't. I mean, they pretty much were willing to accept it, except for a few faculty members, and same in Bozeman. The administration, at least overtly, were cooperative and willing to go along. Now there were issues with them later where they tried to conceal resources and things of that sort, and we had some animosity there.
So but
how this
yeah.
See how this worked out. The Constitution provides that the regents will define the role and powers of the commissioner. So the first Board of Regents could have defined the commissioner as essentially an executive secretary.
Right.
Game over. But they weren't going to, and it's like so many Supreme Court cases now that are being brought to challenge the Affordable Care Act statutorily rather than constitutionally. It depended on the wording of one line that what we preferred and what actually happened was the presidents would report to the Commissioner of Higher Education. What Bowers and the people at Missoula wanted is the president will report to the Board of Regents through the Commissioner of Higher Education. You know, very minor difference. And we won on that.
Not to a university president, however. Not a minor difference.
Well, and the other, as I recall now, I almost forgot, the faculty senates at both Bozeman and Missoula passed resolutions in support of Bowers and what he wanted and against what I wanted. But they didn't get around to it until the action was already taken. So
the door was already locked.
Yeah, and I say in my book, their resolutions had all the impact of a snowflake hitting the Missouri River.
Yeah,
but it was to no avail. But it was kind of, I won't call it typical, but it was one of those things where they weren't abreast of what was going on.
One of the big fusses that occurred as, again, realizing this was all brand new and it was evolving and there was challenges to it and all kinds of things, was the famous or the infamous Blue Ribbon Commission, which has been subject of a lot of stuff over the years about how did that happen and how did things get kind of sideways, and particularly what was the perceived that old story about if you create a commission, you got to live with kind of what they recommend, and if they recommend stuff you don't like, what do you do? Now, this was a governor's, really a governor's commission.
It was it was created by the legislature. Oh. It was born a bastard to begin with, because the person who persuaded the legislature to do this was Dodie Kohlberg, who was superintendent of public instruction. Had nothing to do with higher education. It wasn't her jurisdiction, but she persuaded the legislature to pass the Enabling Act, and then the commission was appointed by the governor, and we were still on good terms then. And Ted James and I made a mistake. We accepted appointments to that commission, and he became chairman of it. So he was chairman of the Board of Regents and the commission. And we hired a good professional staff member, Pat Callan from California, who subsequently became one of the leading educational policy experts in the country, and is still widely consulted with and quoted. But Pat was very young then, and this was really his first job of that kind. And now the context for that politically, the historical and political context was, as you may remember, in Montana, whenever the budget was tight, there was a knee-jerk reaction on the part of half the population, it seems, that close one of the units of the university system. Never to look elsewhere for savings. And the most vulnerable ones were always the smaller ones. Nobody was going to close Missoula or Bozeman because half the state are alumni of those two.
Particularly probably northern and western.
Yeah, they were the two vulnerable ones. Well, Pat recommended in his first report, his draft report, which as a draft had to be acted on kind of like a first reading by the commission, that Tech be downgraded to 2-year status and Western be closed. And now I made another mistake. When he came to me and said, this is my recommendation, what do you think? And I said, well, it's explosive politically, but you, in terms of your own professional integrity, if that's what you think, you go ahead and recommend what you want to, and Ted and I'll try to take care of the politics. And so Pat recommended that, and it went to the commission, and on first reading was tentatively accepted. And
that had to be explosive.
And so the people blamed for it were Ted and I, and for some reason Linda Scarr, who was vice chairman of the commission from Bozeman. And because my title was Commissioner of Higher Education instead of Chancellor, a lot of people thought that I was the one behind all of this, because I was the commissioner and this was the commission.
Higher Ed Commission. This was the Blue Ribbon Commission.
Yeah, and so it got really, they got really explosive, and I was called by Mike Mansfield. You can imagine how.
Former graduate of the Montana School of Mines, or attendee of the Montana School of Mines.
Right, and then graduate at University of Montana, and faculty at the University of Montana. Well, you do anything that might harm Butte, you're going to hear from him, and as it should have been. And then
I relate to that.
Yeah, right. So I also. I guess cheeky enough, I was invited by the Democratic Central Committee of Silver County to come and discuss that at a time when they all thought it was my recommendation and my fault. And I went down and I had Herb and Mary Pace go with me, because Mary was well known in Butte and well liked, and so was Herb, and I thought that they would give me a little protection. And I started out my comments, and immediately, you like Jimmy Shea, who had been
the former mayor of Walkerville,
and then a state senator, and a Golden Gloves boxer,
right,
came up to where I was standing and challenged me to go outside.
In the alley.
and we were able to.
That was Jimmy, all right.
We were able to quiet that, and I think they were able to listen to me, and as I went through all this and discussed who was who and who had what authority and who recommended what, and I had assured Mike Mansfield, I said, there's going to be another vote on it, and it's not going to carry. And I told Ted James, I said, we need to go to work to lobby against this, and we're undercutting Pat, but we have to do it, otherwise it's going to be just hideous battle. And the governor was very reflective to him, and he and his biggest margin was out of Silver Bow County, and as I said earlier, the delegation from there had always supported the university system, not just their own local institutions. So it was very ticklish politically, but we got through it, and Pat left. We rejected the report, and he left angrily, and I think he ended up going to
went on to a good career.
Maryland. Yeah, he went on to a wonderful career, and so I I made a lot of mistakes with respect to that whole thing, but it should never have occurred anyway. There should never have been a commission at that time. We had a new system, a new constitutional arrangement with a new board and a new commissioner. Let us see what we can do.
Yeah.
Don't impose something else that takes people's valuable time.
Well, with Dodie Kohlberg advancing that, it may have been another case where you had somebody who had some authority in education that didn't like the changes and didn't like the nibbling away at this authority or that. So suddenly you have thrust upon you an evaluation that got out of hand.
Yeah.
I mean, it was very explosive.
Yes, it was. And as it is explosive enough without that, I mean, just having the things we've been discussing, I was under the gun anyway.
Now, when that happens, by the way, when the shrapnel comes from the explosion and you're nearby, you know, you get bloody.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it happened to you.
But I think we got that quieted all right and moved on. But it was there were some hurt feelings still, and I remember at one point later, when the Educational Broadcasting Commission, when there was a bill to fund public broadcasting in Montana. Miraculously, at the last second, that was killed, and that money was used for a new library at Tech.
What happened? How does it? You know, how does that happen?
And so I thought, well, you know, that's okay.
You know,
and
that is a nice library, by the way.
Yeah.
And we have wonderful auditorium in there for theater, for political debates, and lots of other things. Yeah. Now, let me ask you this, because being there at the creation, being in there when it actually happened, when the change occurred, it's dramatic change, and it was very progressive change in education. Protecting education from the vagaries of politics and the attacks of politics, I mean, nothing could be more important for a society.
Yeah.
So you're there at the beginning of that. There's always that retrenchment mode, and we are now 40-some years later. And it seems like almost every session there's some effort at nibbling away at that authority. For example, current legislatures are talking about performance-based financing, so that they say, well, we can't tell you how to spend your money, but we want to allocate we want you to carve up your money a different way, and the regents are dealing with the political world. And so what's your kind of assessment from the outside as to the whole thing?
You know, that's happening all over the country. The new culture, first of all, we always considered college education a public benefit, a public good. And now legislators and businessmen and others around the country want to regard it as a private benefit, and they want the student to bear more of the cost.
Well, I mean, they're very utilitarian about how they look at it.
And the second thing is, we're in this culture in the United States where we believe in free market magic, and we think anything private's better than anything public, and we want all of our nonprofits now to be, quote, run like a business. You know, that's the biggest accolade you can give them, is they're run like a business. Well, nonprofits, including universities, are not meant to be run like a business. They're not out for to look at the bottom line or to make a profit. They're service oriented, and the intangibles are the things that are most valuable, and you can't always measure or spot the results of the payoff of the intangibles. For example, somebody's being influenced by a teacher or a professor, you know, may not show that for 10 or 20 years after getting out. I mean, that's not a very good example, but most of the things that universities stand for are not quantitatively measurable. So people come along with the wrong model. They have a business model they want to impose on the universities. It's like you use an English-French dictionary to translate something from the German. And that's what they're trying to do. And so what happens when you go to performance-based budgeting is the wrong things are measured, but only those things that lend themselves to quantitative measurement are measured. Because how do you measure the really valuable intangibles? And also, you shift to a business model in terms of talking about students as customers, talking about productivity as though there's a product that can be measured. Sure, you can measure how many people graduate and that sort of thing, but knowledge itself is a product.
There's an inherent value.
They're all,
sure.
and the kinds of research that are done and the kind of public services, the kind of cultural
building better people, building better citizens.
Which was the old Jeffersonian idea, what education was all about. People leading better lives, being better citizens. And now it's all, does it lead to a better job? Do do you what your starting
you recover
salary?
your investment.
Yeah, what your starting salary is, though, that's the important thing.
Now, for example, there was a time there, probably when you were in office, that Montana citizens paid between maybe 60 and 70% of the price of a college education for all the students in Montana.
Right.
In-state students.
Yeah.
And that eroded down to about 40%.
Yeah. And probably under 40 at Missoula and Bozeman.
Yeah. And resulting in, well, you know, you got to have a bunch of students. You got to pay more if you're a middle-class family. You got to get loans. Loans keep you from buying, a car or maybe getting a starter home. Has a great impact on the economy, but it's all about, this is all about what your gain is financially from education, rather than that intangible gain of being a good citizen,
and then
a well-rounded human being.
And then in terms of the public benefit, there's no longer any regard for leading a good life as an educated citizen, anything of that sort. It's all on the pressure is to turn out indistinguishable human widgets for entry-level positions in American business, and the business community is beginning to dictate which majors have value and which don't, and this is a threat to the humanities and the arts. And they can't compete when you're measuring quantitative things. Some of the most valuable things in a university are the ones that almost always have to run a deficit. You can't just use the business model in evaluating. So if you have performance-based budgeting and it's inappropriate at using a business model and it's measuring things because they're easily measurable rather than because they're the important things, you're going to encourage bad practices in the university, and you're going to encourage the universities to game the system, and you're going to threaten the humanities and the arts and universities as intellectual and cultural leaders, and you're going to cast doubts on the benefit even of research. You know, because most people know about high school where the teacher is a teacher, but they don't understand that at a university it's quite different. The role is much more complicated, and research and production of knowledge and that sort of thing.
Well, you know, we talk about this being a crucible of change, and dramatic change occurred in university governance and the way it happened in Montana, perhaps more progressive than most other states. And I think we're looking at the challenges of retrenchment, to always watch for that, to be vigilant for that. You were there at the creation. You contributed to Montana being a model for the rest of the nation. And I think it's so great that you've been able to come and share your experiences with us, so that we can benefit from, you know, what is trying not to slide backward in that inherent tension that occurs between money and the value of an education. This state has placed a huge value on education. We have to keep it that way. Larry Pettit, thank you for being with us in the Crucible of Change. We appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Good to be here.